All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us for armchair travel to Greece, specifically Rhodes and Symi, with the Traveling Librarian. So we're joined by Jeff Klapes, the Traveling Librarian, for his newest armchair travel presentation. This series highlights travel photography and stories and travel tips about destinations around the world. This month, we're traveling to Rhodes and Symi, two jewels of the, I didn't pronounce this one here. I didn't practice this. The
Aegean.
Dodecanese,
Oh, Dodecanese.
Dodecanese, the Dodecanese Islands in the eastern Aegean, both of which captivate visitors with their distinct charms. Rhodes boasts a rich history, its ancient ruins and medieval old town echoing tales of knights and ancient civilizations. Meanwhile, tiny nearby Symi enchants with its colorful neoclassical architecture cascading down hillsides to azure waters below. Both islands offer pristine beaches, delectable cuisine, and warm hospitality, making them quintessential destinations for cultural exploration and seaside relaxation in the Greek Isles. And so Jeff, of course, is the recently retired head of reference services over at the Beebe Library in Wakefield, and he is, of course, an avid traveler and photographer. And so I again want to thank the Friends of the Library as well as the Corning Life Sciences Foundation for co-sponsoring. So all nearly 150 of us who are watching live, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Jeff for joining us here today. And Jeff, you can take it away. Thanks so
Thanks,
much.
Robert. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me back. And thanks if you've been to any of my recent programs. I was wondering if you were getting sick of Greek islands, but apparently not, because you're willing to go to a couple more. I do have to ask, did anybody happen to notice that I used ChatGPT to write that little blurb instead of writing it myself? That's why it was a little over the top. Anyway, let me get started. I will share my screen and we'll go right into the program. I think Robert mentioned, but if you didn't, please do put any questions as we go through the program. Feel free to pop any questions in either the chat or preferably the Q&A in your Zoom, and I will try to answer them as we go along, but anything that gets missed, I'll stick around at the end and try to make sure I catch any at the end. And also, I will make sure to share my email with you, so if anybody has any questions after the program, I'm always happy to take email questions and try to answer them if I can. So I'm going to start, and here we go. The first thing I want to do is talk a little bit about how to put these islands on the map, as I do with most of my Greek islands presentations.
Jeff, before you get into it,
yeah.
are we supposed to be sharing? Are we supposed to be seeing your slides right now?
You should. Did I not?
I don't think so. Try again.
Let me see. I thought I shared. Huh, that is strange because it looks like I'm sharing. It thinks I'm sharing. Hold on one sec.
Yeah, during the practice session you shared, but then you unshared when we started, and so
yeah, but
here we go.
Does that work? Oh, okay. Yeah,
we're working now.
I'm not sure what that was, but okay. So yes, so I like to talk a little bit about the islands as a whole. Greece has over 6,000 islands, and there's about 200 or so that are actually inhabited. And I like to point out the specific groups to kind of so you can see them in context. By far, the most popular islands, when you see a tour book, a tour guide, the most popular islands like Santorini and Mykonos are usually the orange ones here. These are the Cyclades Islands, which are so called because they're in a circle, roughly, because the ancient Greeks believed that they were kind of in a circular arrangement around the sacred island of Delos, which is in the middle. The other groups of islands are the Ionians, the Greek ones over in the Ionian Sea. The Dodecanese, which we're going to talk about today, these are the yellow ones. And they are so called because dodeca is the Greek word for 12, and there are 12 major islands in that group. There's also the northern islands that go all the way up to Thrace up in the northern part. and the Sporatus Islands here, which I have not actually been to. That's the only group of islands I haven't been to. And a small group that's very close to Athens in what's called the Saronic Gulf. That's the area right between the Peloponnese and Athens. And there's a number of beautiful islands there, a couple of which we've talked about before. Um, so Rhodes, of all of these 6,000 islands, Rhodes is the fourth largest by size in Greece. It's about 540 square miles, and it's even higher up in population. It's the third largest by population with about 125,000 people. Symi, which we will talk about as well, is a tiny island, very close, about an hour away by ferry. And in contrast, it's tiny, only about 25 square miles and about 2,500 people. So I think you'll see as we look at both of them how very different they are. Most of the people who visit Rhodes do so on a cruise ship. Rhodes City, which is up here, the ancient medieval city of Rhodes at the very northern tip, gets about 250 cruise ships per year. And I think in the last year or two, they had about 300,000 cruise ship passengers coming through the port, which makes it like a number of very over touristed places in the Mediterranean. It makes it one of the most popular cruise stops. But interestingly, the vast majority of people who come to Rhodes, particularly those who come on a cruise ship, don't ever actually leave the city. They may take a side trip down to the ruins at Lindos, which we're going to do, but very few people actually explore the rest of the island. So I hope that you see today that it has much more to offer besides just the brief thing that you might see from a ship. And you can see on this map, the red is the particular areas that I explored. There's a lot to see and do, but you really do need a car. Rhodes has relatively decent public transit for a Greek island, but it's slow. And so I think if you're only there for a few days, I was there for about 5 days, 6 days. You really do want a car to be able to explore at your own pace the different parts of the island. I stayed in the city the whole time, what's known as Rhodes Town, in a nice little guest house on a very quiet side street in the old town, which you can see here. And I loved this place because it had a private walled garden, just a handful of rooms. I think it only had maybe 6 rooms and a pretty view out over the town. That's the view from my room. And my favorite part, we will talk about food several times during this presentation. They had delicious made to order breakfasts. Every night I would message them about what I wanted for breakfast and what time. And in the morning, I would wake up and they would present me with like homemade omelets and Greek coffee and fresh squeezed orange juice and Greek yogurt with honey and fruit and you name it. It was absolutely delightful, particularly since I could eat it in a nice garden like this where they had both sun and shade. It was a wonderful place to stay. So let's talk a little bit about the history. Roughly half of the population of the island lives in or near Rhodes Town, which is now a UNESCO heritage site. And the city goes back to ancient times. You remember the Colossus of Rhodes. We're going to talk about him in a little bit. But most of what's preserved today, most of the city that you see today is actually from the medieval period. And over its long history, the city was, well, it was ancient Greek, it was Roman, it was Byzantine. The Genoese were there for a while, as they were in other parts of the Dodecanese. And probably the most important influence for the purposes of the city that you see today is the Knights Hospitallers were there in control for about 2 centuries, starting in 1300. They were there for a very long time, and about 1480, towards the end of that century, the Ottomans laid siege to the city, but were fortunately defeated. But only about 40 years later, in 1522, there was another siege, which that time was successful, and that ushered in the control of the Ottoman Empire for a very long time, ousted the knights, and very much changed the character of the city and the island for the next few hundred years. The massive fortifications of the city were built by the knights starting in the 14th century. And within the walls of the city is an incredible maze of narrow little streets. And there are about 11 gates that you can still use today to get into the city. You can kind of see a little bit on the left side this map, which fortunately is reproduced in many places throughout the city because it's actually quite easy to get lost. And so it's nice that every so often they have one of these map boards so that you can figure out where you are and how to get where you want to go. It's an enjoyable place to get lost because you can very safely wander the streets and just uh, enjoy what it's like to not really have a sense of where you're going, but all of a sudden come out into a beautiful spot that maybe you recognize, and um, it's a really nice experience. You can explore most of the ramparts, walking around the top of almost all of them, and get a very good view of the port, which is very busy with ferries, tour boats, commercial ships, and cargo ships, and of course cruise ships. You can see one here. This is one of the gates. This is called the Gate of St. John. And here's the port. Unfortunately, I'm not a huge fan of cruising, particularly in recent years where cruise ships have gotten so large that they tend to overwhelm a lot of the small ports. And Rhodes is one of those places. So the cruise ships come sometimes two or three a day, particularly during high season, and they disgorge huge numbers of tourists during the day. However, the good thing is if you're there for more than a day and you stay in the evening, most of those cruise ship passengers go back to their ships at night for dinner. So after about 5 or 6 o'clock at night, you almost have the city to yourself, and it's a really dramatic change in the atmosphere. So if you do go, I would recommend staying overnight, at least one night or 2 nights to get that different feel without having all of the streets crammed with day tourists. Here down in the port, you can see some of the restored windmills. There were originally 13 along these wharves. And another one of the fortified towers in the background. This is called the Tower of France. And the entrance to the inner harbor, which has now two columns with bronze deer. You can kind of see those right about there. As well as lots of tourists and fancy yachts and so forth. But it's a very pretty port to walk around because of the architecture and the views. And this is, of course, where in ancient times, the Colossus of Rhodes, one of the seven ancient wonders of the ancient world, was a huge statue to the sun god Helios. And it was constructed in 280 BC to commemorate a victory when Rhodes was besieged by the armies of Macedon up in the north. And it was over 100 feet high, maybe like picture something that's about two-thirds the height of the Statue of Liberty, give or take. Barely 50 years later, it collapsed in a big earthquake. And the details are unclear, but it probably didn't actually, the way this image, this old image shows here, it probably did not actually stand astride the harbor, since that was, from an engineering standpoint, really doesn't make a lot of sense. If that were the case, they would have had to block the harbor for a very long period of time during the construction of the statue. And not to mention that when it collapsed later, it would have blocked the entrance to a very important working harbor. So it's pretty unlikely, given the limits of engineering and the fact that the ruins actually, when the statue collapsed, they actually laid there in the harbor for about 800 years before they were removed. So the idea that the statue actually stood that way really doesn't make a lot of historic sense. What is more likely is this suggested image, more akin to the idea of the Statue of Liberty, a statue standing on a base, holding aloft a torch representing the sun. This was, after all, the sun god Helios. So this is probably more likely what the original statue would look like. Nowadays, nothing is there, but it's still a pretty port. Around the harbor, where you can walk around this area, this is actually outside the original medieval city wall, so it has a number of newer buildings that are still well worth seeing, including this one. This was one of my favorites. This covered market was built during the Italian period, like in the 1930s. So it has a sort of Italian Art Deco feel, which was very popular at that time. There's a view a little bit further away, and you can see the fortifications behind it. There's also a number of more modern 20th century buildings like this neoclassical bank building. Um, and this one, believe it or not, this is a regional government building for the Dodecanese Islands, which almost looks Venetian, even though it's not from the Venetian period. And there's a wonderful church there. Of course, Greece is an Orthodox country, so there's an Orthodox church every 10 feet. And this very large and ornate one is the Church of the Evangelist right on the harbor front. But a highlight of visiting the city is to stroll completely around the outside of the old walls to get a feel of their massive size. You can actually walk between both the outer walls and the inner walls. You can see that here. And there are numerous towers and bastions as you go around the exterior of the city. Within the city walls, there are endless shops and restaurants. It's a big tourist place, after all, not to mention a number of really nice historic monuments, museums, and just little alleyways that you can explore. Although there is a lot of tourism, if you are willing to step off the beaten path, it only takes a couple of minutes to find yourself in a part of the city where there isn't much tourism. And that's one of the fun parts of exploring it. One little place I would recommend that doesn't get a lot of visitors is this lovely Ottoman library of Hafiz Ahmed Aga, which was founded fairly late, almost in 1800, in 1793. He founded it as a center of Muslim learning. So it has an amazing collection of Islamic art and manuscripts in this beautiful building, which is surrounded by a lovely courtyard and a very peaceful garden. Another site very close by is the clock tower, which you can climb up to the top to be at the very highest point in the city. This was built as late as 1852. And there's a very nice panorama of the city if you go all the way to the top. And even if you don't feel like climbing all the way to the top, the terrace alone has a very good view. There's also a nice cafe if it's hot. So once you get up to the top, you can see in 360 degrees in all directions to get a very good feel of the city, which, because it doesn't have any modern development in it or around it, really doesn't seem to have changed at all since medieval times. This is looking towards the Palace of the Grand Master, which we're going to visit in just a minute, over a more recent school building. And looking over a bastion called the Bastion of St. George, which is one of the largest, over one of the Byzantine churches in the city. And then back in the other direction towards the port, where any modern cruise ship virtually towers over the rest of the city, because most of the cruise ships that come are usually 10, 12 stories high these days. But again, I really want to emphasize that one of the best experiences of the town is to just let yourself stroll aimlessly around and get lost. There are so many little details. I think many of you probably know at this point that my undergraduate studies were in architecture. So that's one of the things that attracts me the most when I'm doing photography. And there's so many wonderful little details in a place like Rhodes. Not just the big important monuments, but just little teeny houses and colors and shapes. It's a beautiful spot. The most visited site probably in the entire city, and if you were only there for a short time and were only going to do one thing, you would definitely go to the Palace of the Grand Master of the Knights of Rhodes. The Grand Master, during that period when the knights controlled the island, was both the political and kind of the spiritual leader of the city, of the knights rather, because the knights were, after all, a religious order as well as a military one. And he ruled from this massive fortress, which was originally built in the 7th century by the Byzantines. And then later on, when the knights arrived many hundreds of years later in the 14th century, they turned it into their administrative center and greatly increased its fortifications and expanded it significantly. Unfortunately, in 1856, there was a store of gunpowder stored in a nearby building, which exploded, and it caused massive damage to the castle, and was rebuilt when the Italians were in control of the island after World War One, so in the late 20s, 1930s. Um, the problem was the Italians who renovated it were a little bit over exuberant in their renovations. So um, there's some criticism of how accurate the restoration was. This was during the time period when the Dodecanese were controlled by Italy, and the castle was actually used by the King of Italy at the time, Victor Emmanuel, and even by Mussolini as a place to go and vacation. Um, so they did a very nice job completely renovating this structure, but it's not entirely historically accurate. And part of that isn't really their fault because one of the things that was lost in the explosion was a lot of the previous documentation that described in sufficient detail what the original building looked like. So there was a certain amount of guesswork, but it's still a very impressive monument to visit. This is the main courtyard in the middle with its huge staircase going up to the second floor gallery. Whoops. And here inside, there is also a similar staircase that leads up to the next floor that has all of the huge ceremonial rooms in it. Um, I'll point out here one of the things that, again, I'm not sure how historically accurate this is, but it's very pretty. They used a lot of multicolored stone in the construction of the walls, and almost every one of the big grand ceremonial rooms has beautiful mosaic work in the floor. Here's another one. And as you can see, the ceilings are definitely completely reconstructed wooden ceilings. So historically accurate or not, it's well worth visiting, and certainly an impressive monument. And that the museum alone is worth it just for the history of the knights and their presence on the island. Outside is a very long street that runs from the hill where the castle is at the top and runs all the way down towards the castle walls at the bottom. This is called the Street of the Knights of Rhodes. And for Rhodes, being such a labyrinth of tiny little streets, it's one of the few streets in the city that is unusually long, very straight, and very elegant. Part of that is because many of what were called inns were built along this street. The knights were divided into various langues being the French word for tongue, and they were based on where the different members of were from. And each of these langues had an inn which fronted on this street. Originally, it was divided into the Knights of the Auvergne in France, the Knights of France, which at that time was not the modern country we know today, but just a part of it, the Knights of Provence, the Knights of Aragon in Spain, the Knights of Italy, the Knights of Germany, the Knights of England, and later at one point, I believe it was the Knights of Aragon split, and they created a new law called the Knights of Castile, Leon, and Portugal. So there were a whole bunch that changed over time. In each one, you could almost think of it as like fraternities on a modern college campus. They shared culture and shared a place of origin, and they worked together and had their own place within the city. And many of those buildings still exist. You can certainly find umpteen places to eat, good ones and not so good ones, throughout the city just to have a cocktail or a snack or a meal. But the architecture really should not be missed, and it covers many centuries, including a lot of fascinating Ottoman buildings like this one. Don't forget that modern Turkey is only a few miles away. The modern coast of Turkey is very clearly visible from the city across the water. I actually just saw one of the questions in the Q&A is asking about so many domes in the city. And is that a practical structure or was it just the style? Most of the domes that you are seeing probably fall into two different categories. One is there's a number of Byzantine churches in the city, and the Byzantines, most of their churches had a central dome, so it could have been one of those. The other possibility is that during the Ottoman period, a lot of Ottoman mosques, and there are still mosques in the city, as well as Ottoman bathhouses, used domes in their construction. So chances are, if you see a dome, it's one or the other of those kinds of things. Um, Someone also is asking what was the temperature like. I was there in May, which is a nice time to be there because the weather is beautiful at that time of year. It's not too hot, um, and the big tourist season in the summer hasn't quite picked up yet. So it was busy, but it wasn't overly busy. In general, my recommendation for almost anywhere in the Mediterranean is to go in the spring or the fall, because that's when the prices are better. There are most places are less crowded, and the weather is far more pleasant. July and August tends to be beastly hot, and definitely that's true for Rhodes. In contrast to some of the other architecture we've seen, this is the ruins of a 14th century Catholic church. It's known as the Virgin of the Burg, and much of the damage that you see here actually was inflicted in World War II. I should emphasize that history keeps going in Rhodes, and during World War II, the Allies bombed in 1944. The Allies bombed Rhodes. This was during a time period where either the Italians or the Nazis were in control of the Eastern Aegean. And so there was significant damage to the city at that time. And it is one of the few remaining Catholic churches in the island. So obviously it's not still in use. And here you can see the floor plan a little bit better where the original columns would have stood looking back towards the altar. And just some other street scenes with tourists, cats. There will always be cats anywhere, pretty much anywhere in Greece, and ice cream, which is also very popular. Um, and I promised some food, so here's a little bit of food. Once all the cruise ship people have gone back to their dining rooms on their ships, you have your choice of restaurants. Here I treated myself to some very nice eggplant salad, melitsana salata, with some homemade bread and a glass of retsina, which I'm partial to. And then finished it off with a stifado, which is a Greek stew, essentially. There are different kinds of recipes. This one um, had, I think it was lamb for the most part, and it also had chickpeas and potatoes and vegetables and so forth. Greek fries, homemade bread, quite delicious. And I finished it off with my favorite Greek dessert, which is galaktoboureko, a basically a milk pie. It's kind of like a milk custard pie, um, and surrounded by phyllo dough and steeped in a delicious honey syrup. Nighttime, as I mentioned, once a lot of the tourists leave for the day, nighttime really the city quiets down significantly, and feels far less touristy. Not to mention it gets very beautiful. The sun sets down behind the towers, and even the Street of the Knights, which is one of the busiest places in the city because it's right outside the fortress, the Grand Palace, is almost virtually empty, and you might find yourself being the only person on it. This is another of the many inns that I mentioned for the different sections of the Knights. I'm not sure which one this is. I forget. If you know something about heraldry, you could probably figure out which country this one is referring to. And even they light up a lot of the major monuments. This is the clock tower. Um, but it was kind of amazing to see the incredibly busy uh, street from the castle being basically completely empty except for me. And you would never know that just a couple of hours earlier, most of these streets were full of tourists wandering around. There will be some still. This is probably the main shopping street in town, that has some very nice things, some very tacky things. There's a lot of good souvenirs, but also local crafts and other things to buy there. Um, Here's a good example of one of the mosques that I was talking about. Given that the Ottomans were there for so long, um, and this is certainly true of almost any part of certainly the Aegean Islands, as well as much of mainland Greece, particularly in the north. The Ottoman Empire controlled the Eastern Mediterranean for so long that most countries, even if they no longer have a significant Muslim population, still have a lot of leftover architecture and cultural connections to modern Turkey and also the Ottomans. So you'll see a lot of that certainly throughout Rhodes. Here's the castle at night. Uh, Another one of the old inns, and the interior courtyard of the inn also. Many of these inns are still used by different organizations um, for cultural events and private functions and so forth. But I actually found one of the best parts of my day was just taking a stroll late at night. Even the castle takes on this sort of menacing look, and walking around the port with all the tower and the walls lit up. And of course, the cruise ships are there lit up as well. This particular little plaza, which I stumbled upon, has a very interesting history. In addition to just being a charming little space, it's called the Square of the Hebrew Martyrs. And it's in what was originally the old Jewish quarter of the city. There was always a Jewish population in Rhodes throughout centuries. But in 1944, when the Nazis were in control of the Dodecanese Islands, about 1,700 Rhodian Jews were rounded up and sent away to concentration camps, mostly Auschwitz. And today, only one of the original 6 synagogues in the city remains, and that is now the Jewish Museum of Rhodes, which you might be interested in visiting if you go. On a lighter note, you can also shop at the Oh La La gift shop. There's definitely a mix of very powerful and interesting history and tacky tourist souvenirs. Or you can buy traditional sponges. Sponge diving was very important in the Eastern Aegean, also in Symi, which we'll visit later. Being a public librarian, I had to visit the library, which is in this wonderful old medieval building that has a courtyard. This is the outside of it. And again, another one of those maps to help you not get lost. I chatted with the librarians inside. It was kind of fun to see a library that's so very different from the libraries that we have in the US. Um, this is the little magazine room, the children's corner, the reference librarian's desk. There's also a lot of other experiences that you can have, little museums and so forth around the city. I did not go to this one because it got pretty tacky reviews. If 3 dimensions are not enough for you, this one apparently has 9 dimensions. I don't know exactly what that means. I didn't go. But what I would recommend instead for something a bit more cultural is the Archaeological Museum of Rhodes, which is in this beautiful building. Here's the entrance. This is a building from the 15th century that was once the Hospital of the Knights, the actual hospital of the hospitalers. And inside, not only do they have a very good collection of archaeological artifacts from ancient Rhodes, and a very good collection of mosaics, but building itself is very impressive and fascinating because it gives you an idea of what a medieval hospital would have been like. This is the huge centralized central courtyard with the galleries on both floors, as well as the huge hall, which is where patients, mainly wealthy knights and men, of course, would have been treated in this room. And in fact, each of these tiny little doorways that you see off to the side would have been a private room. Certain wealthier knights would have had separate places to go, as well as these being private toilets. Another of the other random buildings around the old city. This is a more recently built mosque. And another Byzantine church. This is from the 16th century, actually a bit later, but built in that style, called the Church of the Holy Trinity, which has an octagonal tower. And this odd little tower, I tried to do some research and was unable to figure out what the purpose was of this very strange little tower. It almost looks like it used to have something on the top, but I wasn't able to figure out what that was. Outside of the city, I want to take you around the island to show you a few things that you would miss if you stayed only in town. And we're going to first head down the East Coast to explore that side. One of the first stops down the East Coast, only a few miles away from town, is Calithea, which in Greek means beautiful view, which it definitely has, in addition to a lovely beach. And it's an interesting architecture because it's like a couple of the other things I showed you. This was built during the Italian period in the Art Deco style, like in the 20s, 1920s, early 1930s. And it was known in ancient times, this particular corner of Rhodes was known for having very healthy spa waters. Now it's just a stylish resort. Plus, you can get married there and have other private events. But for a couple of euros, you can stroll the grounds, spend time in the gardens, have a cocktail, admire the views with the beach. It's a nice place to just stop and get a completely different enjoy a totally different era from what you see in the old city. There's lots of different pavilions and gardens, and a lot of this pebble design floor, which is called Votsalota. Votsala are the little pebbles, and it's a long-standing and highly regarded craft in Greece, particularly in the Dodecanese. You'll see it elsewhere in Greece, but it reaches its high point really in these islands. They choose white colored stones and dark colored stones and make incredibly elaborate mosaic patios, essentially using geometric designs or sometimes natural designs with animals. It's a particularly incredible example. Here they are getting ready for a wedding that was going to take place later in the day. So it makes a nice stop for a drink or a snack along the way as you work your way down the coast. There happened to be right off the coast as I was there a couple of packed tour boats that are very popular for leaving from Rhodes town. You can take these any number of different tour boats that will take you half a day, all day for fishing, sightseeing, and so forth. The one on the right is decked out like a pirate ship, if that's your thing. A little further down the coast, again, just a few miles, is another very popular spot, one of the most popular beaches on all of the island of Rhodes. It's called Anthony Quinn Beach, and it has very clear waters in this beautiful protected bay. It tends to get crowded, as you can imagine. It is named for the actor, Anthony Quinn, because he fell in love with the place when in 1961 he was on the island of Rhodes filming The Guns of Navarone. And he was so entranced by this particular corner of the island that he bought the bay to protect it. Later on, the Greek government annulled the sale because it just seemed not right that a single American should buy up so much land on Rhodes. So they took it back. But anyway, it's at least still protected these days. It has a beautiful view from the hills up above, and it's a great place to go swimming. This is another one of those places that if you're there during the height of summer, you probably wouldn't be able to move around on the beach. So I would recommend the spring or the fall instead. And this is looking up the coast. The area just south of the beach that I was showing you is probably the most built up part of the island, and it's the area that I would avoid. because it just tends to have a lot of uh, not very attractive seaside hotels for tourists who are mainly interested in a quick beach vacation. It tends to get very touristy and crowded. But once you pass this section, the rest of the island is actually relatively unvisited and quite quiet. There's a number of spots even here, though, where you can stop, see a little chapel, a small village, or a stunning view. Inside the island, in the middle, you'll find that Rhodes is surprisingly green and lush in spots, especially in the little hidden valleys. And one of the most popular places to go is called Butterfly Valley, which has some streams and waterfalls coming down from the mountains. Unfortunately, I was there just a few weeks too early because during the month of June, there's a particular species of butterfly that comes out in huge numbers. And when you walk through this valley, there's just butterflies everywhere. But it really is only the month of June that really happens. But it's still worth visiting, even so, because it's just a pleasant walk to get away from the crowds and also to get away from the sun and the heat, because there's ice cold water coming down from the mountains and a very nice river that spills down through the sweet gum trees. It's a very pleasant little outing. And unusually, in addition to the butterflies, there's an unusual animal that lives there, this crab, which I was lucky enough to see. You may not necessarily come across one. This is a freshwater crab, and it only lives here in the streams on the mountain. And the Greeks believe that, and it kind of does, I guess, have a sort of butterfly pattern on its back, which people think is just coincidental, tying it to the butterflies that also live in the valley. So I was lucky enough to just happen to come across one. Also, in this part of the island, on a hill a few miles inland, is the gorgeous monastery of Panagia, Panagia Filerimu, which is about 10 miles or so from the town of Rhodes, and was built by the knights in the 15th century, dedicated to the Virgin Mary. And the complex is really quite beautiful, very elegant. This is another building that was restored by the Italians in the early 20th century. But it's a gorgeous complex, and also has very nice views because it's up so high. You can see pretty much in all directions around the island. This is the kind of unusual cloister. In addition, it was built on an earlier site because it was a hilltop that was important to the ancient Greeks as well. So there was an ancient temple to Athena, the goddess, which you can see the foundations of here. And there's also a path with Stations of the Cross that leads, maybe, I don't know, a kilometer or so to the other end of the hill, where there's an enormous hilltop cross with views all over the south of the island and west over to the sea. And if you take that, you will also be accompanied by plenty of peacocks. I'm not sure quite why there were peacocks all over the place, but there were. And like many places in Greece, you'll also find lots of goats. Moving down the coast, again, going down the east side, I'll stop in a couple places. This is a place you wouldn't necessarily stop. It's not that exciting, but I like to climb up to old ruined castles. So this is the castle of Ferraclos, and it existed before the knights, but they captured it and they enlarged it. Now it's mostly in ruins because it was eventually captured by the Ottomans, like so many other parts of the island. But the Ottomans abandoned it after a while, and now it's nothing but picturesque ruins. But it does have beautiful views. In fact, you can see up and down the coast all the way to the next thing that we're going to visit, which is Lindos. You can see it way off in the distance. The little seaside beach village down below is called Haraki. But about 40 kilometers south of the town of Rhodes is the bay and peninsula of Lindos, which is probably the second most famous thing on the island. And in fact, it's one of the most famous archaeological sites in all of Greece. It was founded probably about the 10th century BC. And the site here, this is an aerial view from Google. And you can see, in addition to the town, which nestles below it, and a couple of beaches on either side, the Acropolis, which is where the ruins are, is on a very high bluff looking over the sea. It is often visited as a day excursion from Rhodes. It's probably an hour or so down the coast. So there are plenty of bus trips that will take you there, or you can rent your own car if you wanted to. I would highly recommend trying to go very early in the morning or very late in the day to avoid the biggest crowds and also to avoid the heat of midday. Um, and even more so, if you can afford a little extra time, stay overnight because the village is just beautiful. And again, like Rhodes Town, a lot of the day trippers go home, so you have it a little more. It's a little more peaceful. This was used in the classical age for a major temple to the goddess Athena. But in later periods, like during the Roman period, during the period of the Knights, other additional structures were added, including the massive fortress that you can see now, which were built to defend against the Ottomans. And it's just a stunning site with whitewashed houses sprinkled around the base of the hill, a couple of beautiful beaches on either side, and um, the Acropolis looming up over it, which is lit up at night, is quite a stunning sight. It is a bit of a climb, so if you have if you have mobility issues, it might not be the easiest place to visit. Um, but to give you an idea of what it originally would have looked like, this is a reconstruction to help you visualize the procession of the different buildings. Um, Once you climb up to the top of the hill, you ascend through a ramp, which still exists. And then there was this procession of very elaborate stoas and temples and grand staircases that eventually brought you to the temple of Athena, perched right on the cliff, high up over the sea, way off in the back. And most of the foundations of all of this is still there, so you can still get a pretty good idea of how it was, how it all originally fit together. This is the main entrance on the west side, and you can see the different layers of history piled on top of each other as you look up to the fortifications. Here's the main entrance I showed you with, which is really the only entrance into this complex. And once you get inside, you start in an area that was originally dominated by Roman era buildings and fortifications built by the knights, and even an Orthodox church, which you can see up on the upper right here, that was from built in the 13th century. It's a very nice site. You can take organized tours if you want a guide to actually explain to you as you go through, or you could buy a guidebook, or they have very excellent panels that explain the history as you walk through the place if you don't want to have a guide. This is a better view of that Christian church, the Church of St. John, and what was called an exedra, um, which essentially was a bench where people would hang out and converse out in the open. Here is the monumental staircase that goes up to the area known as the propylaea. And finally, at the top on the left, you can see what is left of the temple to Athena right on the very edge of the cliff. It's one of the most photographed sites in Greece with unmatched views over the Aegean. And this is looking back down the staircase. The narrow little staircase that is one level below this one here was built much later during the Hellenistic period, a few centuries after the glory days of ancient Greece. You can see it better here on the right. And here's a view looking through uh, the later um, medieval battlements, looking down to the village below. The village actually is kind of interesting because it looks more like the villages that you would see in the Cyclades, which have the cubic whitewashed houses with flat roofs. And of course, it's a very typical island style with a maze of narrow little pedestrian streets that you can enjoy getting lost in. It's very touristy, but just like Rhodes, there's a few major streets that have places to stay and souvenir shops and cafes and bars. But it takes very little effort to get off the tourist track and just wander through quiet little streets that have virtually nobody on them. So it's an enjoyable place to get lost. This is looking down. You can swim, as I said, on both sides. This is looking down at the incredible blue of the Aegean Sea and some more views from the top. I noticed, speaking of swimming, I noticed another question in the chat is what was the temperature like? The temperature in most of Greece and most of the Greek islands tends to be beastly hot during the summer, July and August, but very pleasant from like late March through early June. I was here in May, so it was warm, but not unpleasantly warm. I would say it was around 80s to low 80s and fairly dry, not humid like we have here in Boston. For those of you who are in the Boston area, um, our summers are much more humid than you get in the Aegean. So it was actually a very pleasant time. The other nice time to be there would be like late September, October, even into November. Someone also asked about walking alone. Do you need to worry about robbery? I certainly didn't. Rhodes is a very safe place to travel. Obviously, any place where there are crowds and tourists who want to take reasonable, sensible precautions. Don't walk around wearing incredibly expensive jewelry. Don't carry your $2,500 camera without keeping an eye on it. Those are the kind of sensible things that you do in pretty much any place where there's a lot of tourists. But for actual like violent crime is almost unknown, and I certainly wouldn't worry walking around the streets even at night. And someone else was also asking about um, the roads not being smooth. I assume you mean the roads in the old city. Was that a construction to impede attack by a horseback or cart? It was just the way they built roads then. Even in other parts of Europe and even in the United States, until modern, really not until the 19th century did they develop the kind of flat roads that we would see today, unless you were building. Um, some of the Roman roads had very large stones, but that really wasn't an option here. So it was just the same kind of cobblestones that you would see um, in almost any city of that time period. It had no particular strategic significance. It was just the way they built things back then. This is the theater, which a lot of people don't bother to visit because it's kind of tucked away in a corner of the town on the outskirts. There isn't really that much to see there, but it's interesting on the hillside just south of the city. And of course, you should stop somewhere in the town just to get a cocktail. Uh, I liked this old-fashioned sign. I treated myself again to a dessert. This is kataifi pastry. So kind of like it's akin to baklava, except more like shredded wheat and soaked with nuts and honey and sesame and so forth. Now we're going to head down the west coast, where I had to stop at another public library in the suburb of Kremasti. I liked this building. It was a beautiful Greek temple structure. And I talked with the librarian inside, and I had an interesting conversation with him. It was just I found it an interesting story that in the 1920s, when the building was built, it was basically funded entirely by a group of American Greeks um, who had connections to the island of Rhodes. There's a number of castles also on the way down the east coast. Um, both coasts, whether east or west, tend to get less developed the further down, the further south you go. On the west coast, the first thing you pass is a number of suburbs and then the airport. But as soon as you get past the airport, there really isn't too much, and it's much more mountainous than the east coast and less arid. There's a lot more greenery. This particular castle is called Kritinia, and was built again during the period of the Knights in the late 1400s to defend against the Ottomans. It's very impressive, has beautiful views up and down the East Coast. And you can see right up here on the top, this is the arms of one of the Grand Masters, the Grand Master who happened to be there at the time that the castle was built. And you can also see some really nice offshore islets. Most of the ones you can see here are relatively small and also uninhabited, but you can visit them on boat excursions to enjoy the beaches or go fishing. And a very typical Aegean landscape with just incredibly blue water, crystal clear. An unusual thing to do on this side, if you have a little time and good knees, is right next to the road. This unusual formation is called Jacob's Canyon, and it's the start of a hike that you can do over maybe 2 or 3 hours. It's fairly strenuous if you keep going. But if you don't want to, you can just walk in a couple hundred yards and see some incredible rock formations just a couple of minutes from the road where you park your car. So this is obviously very sedimentary rock formations. And I don't know if it ever, I would assume at some points of year, if there happen to be flash floods or extreme weather events, they might get some water in it, but basically it's dry for most of the year. So I didn't go very far, but if you're willing to do a little clambering over rocks, you can see some pretty incredible scenery. The next castle a little further down is called Castro Monolithu. And once again, it was built by the Knights. It was built about the same time and for the same reason, to defend against the Ottomans. This one is on this incredible rock outcrop. Perfect spot to put a defensive fortress. There's even a little chapel inside. I would recommend visiting a lot of these chapels. The countryside is littered with Orthodox chapels, and many of them will be locked, but it's always worth it to stop and see if it's open, and then you can peek inside. And just some more landscape views. This is way down in the south, the southern landscape, which is quite verdant. There's olive production, there's other kinds of agriculture, including wine, but a surprising amount of forest for an island that's so far south in the Mediterranean. And I do want to mention that despite its being green, Rhodes is also subject to wildfires like the rest of the Mediterranean. And you can see here in this map, which is from just about a year ago in 2023 in the summer, the extent of the massive fire. You may have heard about it in the news that devastated a significant part of central Rhodes. And actually, they had to evacuate a number of coastal areas where there were some beach resorts, but all of this yellow area was burned during that summer. And the last thing I'll show you on this side of the island is um, one of the earliest ruins on the island. There originally were three cities in the north um, from ancient times that eventually combined their administration into one and created the city, the original city of ancient city of Rhodes, where the medieval city is today. This is not a terribly visited ancient site, which makes it nice because it's not going to be crawling with tourists. It's called Camiros, and it's I don't know, maybe half an hour south of the airport in the middle of the west coast. And it's a very nice site because it goes up the hill on three different levels with an acropolis at the top and a view out over the ocean. There was a temple to Athena at the top, as well as a very long stoa. You can see the foundations of it here across the top of the hill. And then looking down, the foundations of most of the foundations of the town are still there. So what you're seeing here are many of the houses that spill down the hill towards the sea through the what originally would have been the residential part of the city and the commercial part of the city. Uh, for some reason, I noticed it in particular when I stopped there. This is the parking lot to that place. Almost every rental car on Rhodes is white. I don't know why that is. Maybe all the places got a deal on white cars. Back in town for dinner, I had another delicious dinner. Here's some homemade tzatziki with crusty bread, roasted vegetables from the grill, and I had another stew, although this one was almost entirely vegetarian. So potatoes, tomatoes, zucchini, eggplant, and lots of delicious olive oil, garlic, herbs, and so forth. As I mentioned before, there's lots of activity going on in the port. Here you can see, I don't think there was a day that I was there where there weren't at least three decent sized cruise ships. There are some large ones, some small ones, private yachts, and then way off in the distance is one of the Greek ferries. There's ferries that connect most of the islands. Rhodes is probably, if you're coming from Athens, you would probably want to get to Rhodes not by ferry but by plane because it's only about an hour, and the ferry ride would be quite long. But once you're in Rhodes, you can easily visit a lot of the other nearby islands with ferries. And this is looking back from the port towards the city itself. I was there for, I forget, it was either 5 or 6 days. And I think that was enough, not necessarily to see absolutely everything on the island, but if you, especially if you want some time for just sitting on the beach and doing nothing. But 5 days would certainly give you plenty of time to visit the major historic sites and do a little bit of exploring as well. And so we're going to finish by heading off to Symi, which on the other hand is extremely different from Rhodes. You can go on a day trip. It's easily reached by several ferries and also actual tour boats that go there specifically for taking you on a guided tour. Um, or you could escape there for a couple of days and get some peace and quiet. It's very tiny compared to Rhodes, very mountainous, and has really only one main town, but it's absolutely picture postcard perfect. The land on the right that you see here on the map is actually mainland Turkey. That's how close we are to the Turkish coast. And most of the boats that take you there from Rhodes are going to go along this side and go to the main town of Symi, which is in this little cove here. And then many of them stop on the way back on this in this tiny little bay here where there is a beautiful monastery that I'll show you on the opposite side of the island. Besides that, the few other villages on the island are incredibly tiny, and there's hardly any roads to speak of. It was originally big into shipbuilding um, decades and centuries ago, and also sponge fishing. But now Simi really relies mostly on tourism, which it excels at because it is so beautiful. Huge cliffs come down to the sea. It's extremely arid compared to the forested places that you see in on Rhodes. But it's very accessible. It takes maybe if you take a fast ferry, it's about an hour and a half at most, hour and a quarter, and you pass the beautiful rugged coastline as you approach the town. This is the harbor with its neoclassical homes kind of spilling down the hillsides. Like on Rhodes, many of the buildings in the town were damaged by Allied bombing during World War II, but there was a major restoration campaign, and most of those buildings were fixed up again, and now it's absolutely charming. Most of the homes, like I said, are neoclassical, which is very different from what you would see in Old Town Roads, and very different from what we would see in most of the Cyclades Islands. Also, it has a very Italian feel to it. Um, and the pastel colors just contribute to that. And of course, because it's built in this sort of like an amphitheater around the cove up the mountains, it's a very Instagrammable spot. Let me put it that way. To be perfectly honest, there's not a lot to do on Symi. It's a place to go and kind of get away um, and just enjoy the beauty. You can stroll, you can hike. So you may find that a day trip is perfectly fine, which is what I did. Um, it's very hilly, so if you visit, you're going to need to do a lot of climbing as you travel around. Here's one of the churches way up high over the harbor, and also the clock tower at the main dock, the ferry dock, which was built pretty recently. It may look medieval, but it was built in the 1880s. And like I said, the views, particularly since it's built around this cove, so you can very easily, if you're on one side, you can see the other side. It's a photographer's dream. This is the ferry heading back, leading back to Rhodes. Here is a good example of the before and after of some of the renovations. There are still plenty of buildings in Symi that could use some fixing up. I thought this one was interesting because, for whatever reason, they've beautifully restored the right hand side, but not the left. Perhaps they're owned by different owners. And all along the promenade around the waterfront, there are lots of typical Greek cafes and tavernas. There are cars on the island, but not very many because there are so few roads and so few places to actually go. And you can easily explore the town itself on foot as long as you're willing to climb a lot of stairs that go up the little hillside alleyways. But you are rewarded at the top with stunning views back down to the harbor and out to the rest of the island, and even off to the coast of Turkey, the mainland of Turkey, which you can see off in the distance. On the backside of the town, just behind the hill, is another tiny little settlement called Peri, which unfortunately became a news item this summer because of the disappearance of a British TV presenter named Michael Mosley, who was there on vacation. He was very popular in Britain. And he went hiking alone in the heat during the summer. There were actually a number of tourists who did this. It's not a good idea. He went by himself and he apparently got disoriented in the heat, and his body was found dead, not terribly far from the resort he was staying at, which was quite a tragedy. And certainly in the heat of the summer, you definitely don't want to be doing things like hiking alone in areas you don't know and without water, because with temperatures sometimes getting over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, it can be a very risky thing to do. This is actually not an aerial photo. This is actually looking down from the terrace of one of the churches high up on the hill, where you can see pretty much the entire panorama of the main town of the island. And here's a close up of right in the middle. This brightly painted place turned out to be a swanky resort that has been fixed up. And I kind of like the colors almost make me think of North Africa rather than Greece. And while I was up there, I was surprised to see a flotilla of boats that were all coming in at the same time, which made me think something's going on. And it turned out something was going on. They all headed right into the little harbor where there are already plenty of ferry boats and pleasure boats. And there seemed to be an extra number of Greek flags out. So I suspected something was going on. And so as I walked back around to the other side, onto this side of the harbor, passing the beautiful church. This is the main church on the island, the holy metropolis of Symi, which also has these beautiful pebble mosaics that are typical of the region. Again, for someone who likes architectural photography, this is just a paradise for details and colors. But so, as I said, as I'm going back, wondering what's going on with all this activity coming into the port. Um, what were the boats for? Well, it turned out there were soldiers marching up and down. It turned out that just by coincidence, I happened to go there on May 8th, which is the day that in 1945, the Germans, who had been occupying the Dodecanese Islands, they surrendered at the end of the war. They surrendered the islands to the British. The British uh, governed the islands for another 2 years before they were formally reunited into the modern Greek nation. So May 8th is actually a day for celebration in the Dodecanese Islands. And despite Symi being this tiny little place, they had quite a celebration. So all the locals came out. They were dressed in traditional outfits. There was music, there was dancing. The sign on the right refers to the kindergarten of Symi, Nipiagoio. So kids and adults were all dressed up, military parades, lots of pomp, lots of circumstance, lots of speeches. So that was kind of fun to just uh, serendipitously fall into a local festival. The only other real thing to see on the island, other than the beautiful landscape, is the monastery of the Archangel Michael Panormitis, which was built in the 18th century. And quite unusual for a monastery, it's right on the water where it's very exposed, very accessible. Monasteries tend to be built in very isolated places where it makes sense because the monks are trying to get away from the world. So it was a little strange to have this monastery, very elaborate, wealthy monastery built right smack on the water on a very beautiful port on the west side of the island, opposite the main town. And like I mentioned earlier, if you take a day trip from Rhodes, many of the boats will stop here for an hour or so to let you see the complex and walk around and enjoy the waterfront for a little bit before heading back to Rhodes. It's so this is a very much more recent 18th century is a very classical style. There was a monastic community here as far back as the Frankish occupation, so going back to more or less the time when the knights were here in the 14th century. But pretty much everything that you see now in the monastery was built in the late 18th century, like the 1780s, give or take, including this incredible Venetian style bell tower, very Baroque, very detailed, with all these beautiful colored decorations and terracotta stuff stuck onto it. And the church is just stunning. Inside, it's completely covered top to bottom with frescoes and elaborate chandeliers. On the right is the silver leafed icon of St. Michael, He happens to also be the patron saint of Symi, and just I was I couldn't get over how incredible these frescoes were, and in superb condition. Not to mention the iconostasis, which is the if you're not familiar with Orthodox churches, it tends to be the elaborately carved screen that separates the altar from the congregation and is covered with icons representing various saints. This one is carved out of wood, and the detail in it is just incredible. And here are some shots of the very serene classical look of the outside of the building. Um, there were, of course, many goats wandering around. There's always goats in Greece, and I found this sign kind of amusing. What it advises you to do is to not park here. There was a parking lot behind the church for people who drove there, and they suggested that you don't park here under the trees because the goats actually try to climb up the trees and can damage your car if you're parked underneath because they can drop things or poop on your car or actually climb on your car to get onto the trees. And also in this beautiful little bay, before you head back to Rhodes, this sheltered harbor, you can stroll all the way around it, which is very pretty. And there's a nice traditional windmill at the entrance, guarding the entrance to the bay. And then an hour and a half or so will take you back from Symi all the way back to Rhodes, where you will be able to have a delicious dinner. I'm going to stop the program there and unshare my screen. And let's just see if, have I missed any? Yes, I've missed a few questions. Let's see. Where did all that stone come from for the Acropolis? This is Greece. There is no shortage of stone. Everything is stone. So even today, many parts of Greece have uh, uh, what's the word I want? Quarries for all different kinds of stone. In particular, um, marble is still quarried in a number of parts of Greece specific areas. But yeah, if you need stone in Greece, all you have to do is look down, and there will be some stone that you can use for something. Let's see, what happened to the Colossus of Rhodes? I covered that at the beginning. Maybe you missed it. The Colossus of Rhodes fell in an earthquake about 50 years after it was constructed. It was made of bronze, actually. This was not a stone statue. It was similar to the Statue of Liberty. It was metal, hollow in the middle, with a frame. Although it's a lot of that is conjecture based on what historic documents we have. But it collapsed in an earthquake about 50 years after it was put up. So it never actually lasted all that long. And the ruins collapsed into the harbor, where they lay for several centuries before they were eventually taken away. So there is nothing left anywhere of the Colossus of Rhodes other than imaginary images, most of which come from long after the original Colossus lived and died, so to speak. So there's nobody knows exactly what it looks like at this point. What language is spoken? This is Greece, so Greek. Modern Greek is spoken here. Even though Greek has some dialects depending on which part of the country you're in, particularly Crete to the south. But in Greece, in the Dodecanese Islands on Rhodes, you will hear basically just modern Greek. But if you're asking because of tourism, if you're planning to travel there, many Greeks, particularly any Greek who is probably younger than 40 or 50 years old, speaks at least some English. And certainly English is the most widely spoken language in anything that has to do with tourism. So I always recommend learning a little bit of no matter which country you're visiting anywhere in the world, I think you should take the time to learn how to say please, thank you, good morning, good evening, where is, things like that, basic phrases. Um, and but if you're traveling anywhere in Rhodes, you're going to hear Greek, you're going to hear English spoken quite a bit. Do I speak Greek? Yes, I do. I've been learning Greek for several years. I never learned it growing up. My father's family was Greek, but my generation never was taught Greek when we were children. So I heard a lot of Greek as a child, but I actually didn't start learning it until a few years ago. So I'm kind of intermediate. I can hold my own in a conversation and understand what people are saying, but I'm far from fluent, but I manage. And I practice a lot when I'm in Greece. Um, let's see. Who would be a Greek master, a grand master? The grand masters were uh, basically the political leader of the knights. And if you look online, you will see a long list because the knights, of course, lasted centuries. So there were scads of different grand masters over different time periods. And I doubt very much that any of them would be people whose names you would recognize. Um, the only one that I can think of who I've ever heard of outside of my research into things like this is Jacques de Molay, who was from a later time period than this. There were also different groups of knights. There were the Knights of Malta. There were the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitallers. So there was not one single group of knights. Um, but I think other than De Molay, I couldn't tell you the name of a specific grandmaster. But the point is, his role was to basically be the leader of the knights at any particular time. And after he left, usually because of death, a new grandmaster would be selected. Um, with so many islands, has the Greek government ever sold off to any moguls? There are a few privately owned islands. Um, I don't think that Greece would actually benefit financially from that. Um, but there's certainly Onassis had his own island. There's I read somewhere recently there's one of the islands that was privately owned is for sale again, and I forget where. I think it was in the Ionians. Most of those are very tiny islands. They're not big islands, um, and I can't think of any off the top of my head that are for sale at the moment. Um, since there are few roads, do the residents travel by sea to the? Oh no, Rhodes has plenty of roads, so to speak. Um, there are. It's actually quite easy to drive around Greece, even on the islands, which is why I recommend renting a car if you go there. Um, it's the roads are in pretty decent condition unless you go off into the middle of nowhere mountains. Roads actually has the coastal roads are very fast. They're no different from any road that you would find in other parts of Europe or the United States. Um, Tiny little villages up in the mountains. The roads tend to get narrow and twisty, but for the people who live there, Rhodes, as I said, is one of the biggest and most populated islands, and certainly has plenty of commerce. And it's no different from driving around any part of New England. How much signage is in English? Quite a bit, actually, because the Greek islands get tourists from all over, British and American tourists, but also all over Western and Eastern Europe. And English tends to be the common language. So you'll see a lot of English language signs to make it easier for people. Road signs, if you're driving, are usually in both the Greek and Roman alphabets. So if you don't know the Greek alphabet, you will see them transliterated um, pretty much unless you're really in the middle of nowhere, which is not going to happen on roads. Road signs not just directional signs telling you where you're going, but also things like slow, toll booth, like anything like that, you're going to see in both languages, or at least in both alphabets. Um, Somebody's asking about the agriculture. I didn't happen to take a lot of um, photographs of agriculture on this particular trip, but there is quite a bit. Um, Vegetables are fresh vegetables, particularly during the main growing season, which is very long in Greece. Um, I've never had tomatoes as good as Greek tomatoes. They're just fantastic. And Rhodes does have quite a bit of agriculture, particularly uh, grapes, olives, um, and all kinds of Mediterranean vegetable and fruit crops. So yes, you will see a lot of that there. I just didn't happen to take a lot of photographs in this particular presentation. Um, Somebody's asking about Athena because there were so many um, temples to her. And that's a good question. I should have double checked that because that occurred to me as well. Um, I don't remember Athena having a particular connection. Actually, Helios is the god of the sun god, um, is probably the god most connected with the island of Rhodes in antiquity. In fact, for a long time, Rhodes was called the island of the sun. And that's why the Colossus of Rhodes was supposed to be a statue of Helios. Um, so I don't actually know why Athena, other than the fact that she was an important goddess in general, I'm not sure why so many of those temples were dedicated to her, but that would be something I can look into and get back to you. I can let Robert know when he sends a follow-up email. Um, can you navigate with English? Absolutely, particularly on Rhodes, which is very touristy. English is widely spoken throughout most of Greece, particularly any touristy area. It's only when you get into very small, off the beaten track villages that you might have trouble with English. Have I presented a program on Crete? If not, will I? Absolutely. I do not have a program on Crete because I've never been. Um, and it's been high on my list for a while. I really want to go to Crete. Um, but and when I do, I will do a program. But at the moment, I don't have one. The next one I will probably do because I'm going back to Greece in October, and I will spend some time on Kerkyra, which is better known in English as Corfu. That's an Ionian island with a lot more influence from Italy. So I'll be there this fall, and we'll definitely put together a program on Corfu because it's another one of the most popular and historic islands. And eventually, I'll get to Crete. Um, Not Rhodes. I'm not sure what that question's referring to. Something about. Oh, I see. The person who asked about the accessibility of the roads was actually, she said she was actually referring to Symi. I didn't drive on Symi because there was really no need to. There are perfectly decent paved roads on Symi. It's just that there's not a lot of places to go. You can drive um, from the main town to the monastery on the opposite side, but I think if you were to stay there for longer than a day trip, I don't know that I'd bother renting a car. You could, but I don't know that you really need to because it's so small that if you wanted to go anywhere, you could just take a taxi, and that would probably be easier and cheaper than bothering to rent a car on such a tiny island. And finally, how are Greek fries different from French fries? They are French fries. They're just fried potatoes. But I would say this: Greek French fries, if they do them the way I like them, is they're very crispy. They put sea salt on them and a little oregano. That's the best way, I think, to do good Greek French fries. And it depends on where you eat. Like fried potatoes everywhere, some people do them well and some people don't. Um, so I'm partial to the ones that use sea salt and oregano. Really, really good. Um, Someone's asking about Corfu. So yes, just to repeat, I'm going there next month. No, 2 months, October, and I will put together a program on Corfu as soon as I get back. My contact info, which Robert will send that out um, in his follow-up email, but I'm going to put my email. I am just jeffklapes@gmail.com. So do feel free to send me an email with any questions or comments. Um, and I'm also on Instagram if you want to follow me there, where I publish a lot of travel and architectural photography. And I'll have Robert um, send this out in his follow-up email just in case you miss it.
Yeah, Jeff, I will definitely include both a link to your Instagram and I'll include your email address as well in the follow-up email. Did you get everything, Jeff? It looks like you
I
got
think
everything.
so. One last one. Which Greek islands have I visited and how is medical care? I've been to about 15, 16 Greek islands. Um, Hopefully, I'll live long enough to visit all 600. I don't know. And how is medical care for emergencies? It varies widely depending on where. Rhodes is big, touristy. It's no different from going to a lot of big touristy places. It's full of infrastructure and all of that. Symi, on the other hand, is tiny and doesn't have those things. So it really depends on. There's no easy answer to that because the Greek islands come in so many different sizes, flavors, that it's some of them are much more connected to the outside world than others, and they have very different, varying degrees of services and regular services like water, electricity. Um, some don't have airports, all that. So it really depends on where you're going. And this program, I think, was a good example of kind of opposite extremes. Rhodes is very big, very visited, full of infrastructure for tourists. Symi is lovely and perfectly nice, but very tiny and not anywhere near like Rhodes. So that's kind of why I like to talk about them together because they give you an idea of how very different the places can be. So I think that's it.
Great job as always, Jeff. Folks, let's give Jeff another big virtual round of applause for a great presentation. So Jeff will be back with us in just a few weeks on Tuesday, September 17th. It's going to be at 2 o'clock. The September travel programs are going to be at 2 o'clock Eastern. We're shifting temporarily. And Jeff will be talking about just travel photography in general, and he'll be offering some travel photography tips and showing some of his favorite photographs from his travels. So something a little different, okay? Similar but different. So looking forward to that. Information about that will be in the follow-up email, as well as the recording and Jeff's contact information. And when you exit the Zoom today, make sure to take 60 seconds and fill out the feedback survey that will pop up. That'll just be for people who are watching live. Jeff, any last words for the audience before we wrap
No,
it up?
thank you again for joining me. And I always love doing programs for you guys because you're so engaged. You have great questions. And so, like I said, I hope you're not getting sick of Greek islands. I do go other places, but it seems lately I've been going to Greek islands. So I do hope to see you later on this year, hopefully for a presentation on Corfu. And yeah, the travel photography one I'm looking forward to because it's a little bit different and it takes me back to some photography I did a few years ago that I haven't really looked at recently. So it'll be a fun diversion from some of the things we've done recently.
All right, excellent. So, Jeff, we'll see you in 3 weeks, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. Thanks again.
Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.
Bye.